Yo, what's up? Dr. Swole here, MD bodybuilder, back with another video. Today we're going to be talking about direct training for rear delts, traps, and forearms. Is it necessary? At this point, I put out quite a few full hypertrophy programs on YouTube. And one of the most common questions I get asked is why there's no direct training for the rear delts, traps, and forearms. Today we're going to be talking about my reasoning for doing so. Quick outline for today, we're going to be talking about direct training for the rear delts, traps, and forearms. As we go over these, we'll talk about which compound exercises train these muscle groups and when you should be training them directly. If you've been getting value from my channel, make sure you smash that like button, hit subscribe, and let's get into it. I personally don't train any of these muscle groups directly, and a lot of natural bodybuilders don't. It's not that there's anything wrong with training these muscle groups directly. The problem arises in the opportunity cost that they present. So, if you're spending time training your forearms directly, for example, that's time that could be spent doing other compound movements or training other muscle groups. For people training in the gym 5 or 6 times a week or more, they might have the time to fit in extra volume like this. But for the most part, people usually suffer from the other problem. They're not in the gym long enough and they spend too much of their time doing isolation work. Okay, let's start off by talking about the rear delts. Your delts are comprised of 3 heads, your rear, lateral, and anterior delts. The anterior delts are trained in most pushing movements and are often overtrained by bodybuilders. So I would not recommend including any direct anterior delt work. The thing about rear delts is that they get trained in most horizontal pulling movements, like rows, especially if you're using a full range of motion. To look at training anatomy, during a horizontal row, your lats actually stop working after you pass the body and start to hyperextend, which is when your arm actually goes behind your body. So for a lot of rows, if you're doing a full range of motion, your arm will actually go behind your body, and this is where rear delts are heavily used. So for a lot of people, if you include enough compound pulling movements, you won't have rear delts as a problem. Now, the other thing here is that for most people, their side delts are usually a bigger weakness. Side delts are the most important muscle group to focus on to make your shoulders look broader. And a lot of natural bodybuilders have weak side delts. I'd recommend that you aim to max out your side delt volume before going on to rear delts. And in terms of actual rear delt training, I'd recommend maxing out your pulling MRV first. Your MRV is your maximal recoverable volume, and it's the most number of sets in a week that you can complete and still recover and grow from. Most trainees, especially beginners, haven't maxed out their back training. So I would recommend first adding more sets to your pulling movements, since this will train your rear delts and will just be a better use of your time, since you'll be activating more muscle mass in total. Now, if you've maxed out your back training volume and your rear delts are still a weakness, then you could try adding in some compound work first. I like face pulls because they train your rear delts, but also get your traps and rotator cuff. When you do the external rotation, your rotator cuff muscles get activated, and training your rotator cuff is important for shoulder health. These can be nice as a warm-up before your pushing movements. You'll notice that I'll always try to prioritize compound movements first, since this is just the most efficient use of time, and most people aren't actually spending that much time in the gym. And if you're just focusing on isolation movements, you're probably not using the most muscle mass possible and building the most amount of mass. After you add in face pulls, if your rear delts are still an issue, then you could add in some rear flies. Okay, let's move on to talk about the traps. The traps are composed of 3 parts. You got your upper, mid, and lower traps. The upper traps work to elevate the scapula. These are very popular to train because the upper traps are very visible muscles and give you that yoked look. The mid traps work to retract the scapulae, and the lower traps work to depress the scapulae. Now, the mid to lower traps actually get trained pretty well in pulling movements. So often here, when people talk about direct trap training, they're talking about the upper traps with things like shrugs. Now, in terms of direct trap training, for your mid and lower traps, I'd recommend just maxing out your back training because this will give you pretty good stimulation. In terms of the upper traps, these actually get worked pretty well in upright rows and lateral raises, which you do for your side delts. As I mentioned, I think side delts are a very important muscle group for bodybuilders. So you'll see that I put lots and lots of volume for those muscle groups in my programs. And I would recommend that you max these out first before putting in direct trap training, because these will train your traps and your side delts, and you're going to get more bang for your buck overall. Now, a word on upright rows. I get asked by a lot of people as to whether these are actually safe. The problem is people either have pre-existing shoulder issues or they're not doing them correctly. Now, the problem people get is impingement pain, which is where one of your rotator cuff tendons gets caught in your shoulder joint. You can get around this with some tweaks to your upright row technique. So if you have trouble with impingement, try using a wider grip and focusing on external rotation. What that means is when you're doing the upright row, think about bringing your elbows up and out. One other thing I want to mention is that anecdotally, a lot of bodybuilders find that there's no difference in their traps when they pull out direct trap training. I noticed in myself that I didn't notice any loss of my upper traps when I stopped doing shrugs years ago. So I would recommend that you first max out your back and your side delt training before actually thinking about putting in shrugs. So more pulling movements, upright rows, and side raises. Now after this, if your upper traps are still a weak point, then you could add in shrugs on your back days. Alright guys, we had some audio problems and I just went off and worked a shift. Now it's midnight, but we're back and we're going to finish this video. So let's talk about forearms. Forearms are trained in wrist flexion and wrist extension movements, as well as with grip. Now the thing about forearms is that they get a lot of work from arm training. So for example, a bicep curl will activate your forearm flexors very well. And the other thing is you get a lot of grip work through any type of heavy pulling or deadlift variation. Now the thing is, if you have a balanced program including lots of arm work, heavy pulling, and deadlift variations, you'll probably get all the stimulus you need for your forearms, at least at a beginner stage. So I'd recommend that you first max out your arm MRV. That is, if you feel that your forearms are lacking, instead of adding wrist curls, try adding some more bicep curls or other arm movements. The other point here is to challenge your grip as much as possible. So if you're going to use straps, only use the straps when you actually need them. You don't want your grip to be limiting you in terms of growing your other muscle groups, but you don't want to be using straps unnecessarily either. Okay, another tip for forearms is to train your brachioradialis. The brachioradialis is this muscle here, and sometimes people call it the beer drinking muscle because it gets used when you flex your arm in a neutral position, like with a hammer curl. So in terms of programming your bicep training, I would recommend that you include a hammer type curl in most of your programming. This doesn't have to be there all the time, but for the most part, I would try and keep some variation in there. If you want to swap out your hammer curl because it's getting stale, note that you can also get some brachioradialis stimulation from a neutral grip pulling type movement, like a neutral grip pull down. Lastly, I would say that most bodybuilders in general don't need to train their forearms directly, because they're going to get lots of stimulation from your arm and grip work. I would only train forearms directly if there's still a weak point after you've optimized your training volumes for all your major compound movements and your other muscle groups, and if you have time. So I don't want to see people training forearms if they're not doing enough volume for their legs or their back or their arms. So in summary, I just want to re-emphasize that there's nothing wrong with training these muscle groups directly, but you should make sure that you optimize your training volumes for your main compound movements and other muscle groups first. Once you do so and you still feel that they're weak points, then you could try adding in some direct work. But for a lot of people, you'll probably get all the stimulation you need from just having a balanced program. Lastly, focusing on compound movements is going to get you the most bang for your buck. And you should really be focusing on these until you get more advanced and start actually running into fatigue issues. That's all for now, guys. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like the video and leave me a comment below. I'm really good about answering every single one of my comments, so you'll definitely hear back from me. In particular, do you train these muscle groups directly? Let me know. If you want to take your fitness knowledge to the next level, check out my affiliate link for mass or monthly applications in strength sport in the description. This is top level information that I highly recommend. If you want to learn more about bodybuilding splits, check out this playlist where I have some videos going over the most common bodybuilding splits and pros and cons. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time.